Hello, everybody. I continue to be John Atack to this day, and it's my friend John Hunter, PhD, and we're going to talk about something that I think is really, really important, which is how you cope if you have bipolar disorder. And this is perhaps a lot more relevant than people realize. I think that aspects of bipolar are often unrecognized, and John's work has been in part in understanding how large group awareness trainings, LGATs, the likes of EST, LifeSpring, the Landmark Forum, Tony Robbins, people like that, will use certain techniques to bring you into a hypomanic state, which is the beginning of mania. And so it becomes very relevant to us all to understand what that state is, and that it is a neurophysiological state. It's not transcendence into the divine presence or enlightenment. So do you want to, we've done a couple of shows. I think that the summary is that in 2003 you were living in the UK and you had a manic experience. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that and lay the groundwork there? And then we can move into how you cope with it, how you have coped with it.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, thanks so much again. I really appreciate this platform to speak about something like bipolar disorder. I mean, I understand that the other things that I've spoken about are probably more directly relevant to your viewers. So this is something that seems maybe a little bit kind of from left field, but it's something that I'm really passionate about. I run workshops trying to explain the disorder to not only people with the disorder, but also family and friends of people, because that support structure is really important. So yeah, I'm just very appreciative of the chance to speak about it.
Well, let me say that it is incredibly relevant to any audience who are concerned about authoritarian cults, because so many of the leaders of these groups actually appear to have symptoms of bipolar disorder. So understanding the certainty and enthusiasm with which such people deal with the world, I think is very important. So I think this is highly relevant, and left field's a good place to come from anyway. I'm going to take my sweater off while we speak.
Sure. And I think in terms of understanding the disorder, one of the things that is going to come through is that it's not as obvious as the mainstream media and television and movies and that sort of thing might make it seem. So you've got these people that you may not recognize as having the symptoms of what's a very serious mental illness. It's very serious, but at the same time, it can be quite difficult to recognize if you don't know exactly what to look for. In terms of my experience of it, I moved to London in 2002. I just finished a business degree at the University of Cape Town, and I wanted to get into an investment banking. And at the time that I arrived there, 2002, 2003, the FTSE, the stock exchange, was at pretty much an all-time low. It was at an incredible dip, and there were just no jobs available. So I spent about 9 months doing, work that at the time I thought was below what my qualifications suggested I should be doing. So I was under a huge amount of stress trying to find a job in an investment bank. And for 9 months, I was selling paintball on the street, and I was, working at a shipping company, doing manual labor in the snow and this sort of thing. And people around me seemed to be doing incredibly well. I've got an older brother. He was doing his MBA at a top business school in the US. And so that generated a lot of sort of psychological suffering and stress for me. And as we've spoken about before, this is one of the major triggers of manic episodes and bipolar disorder. So I went through this very kind of difficult 9 months. And again, as we've spoken about before, that period of stress followed abruptly by reward tends to lead to these elevated states. So seeking arousal or dopamine elevation. At the time, I didn't know that, but I was offered a job at Credit Suisse, and within 3 days, I was just on top of the world, and I just was having this incredible, what I thought was a religious experience, and what I later found out was a manic episode. And for about 3 months, I was in this incredible sort of elevated state. And to describe what it felt like, I would say euphoria is a good word to associate with it. So just feeling incredibly overwhelmed with joy, very excited as well. So an incredible level of energy and enthusiasm and motivation and just drive. So I was awake for 9 days in a row. So when I first was, from that first manic episode, so when it began, for 9 days I was awake and I had no need for sleep. I didn't feel like I needed sleep. I didn't feel like it wasn't like I had insomnia and I couldn't sleep. I was just excited to be alive and couldn't really stop myself if I wanted to. So I would go for a run in the morning. I would do work throughout the day. At night, I would just go out and interact with a lot of people. So expansiveness or elevated levels of sociability are very common with mania. It looks a lot like a person who's taken a lot of cocaine or methamphetamine or something like that. And the neurobiology, it's theorized to be quite similar as well. So that elevation and dopamine. So what you see is a person that's incredibly excitable, incredibly confident. So just feeling completely bulletproof. So as somebody who's relatively shy, I would feel confident walking up to any group of women and just starting a conversation with them. There would be no fear of rejection. And if there was rejection, it was just as if it didn't really matter. So just feeling an overwhelming sense of comfort with myself, comfort with the world, optimistic about the future, no need for sleep, high level of energy. What also started happening, which is very common with mania, is impulsivity. So because you're in this state where you feel like all of your decisions are going to lead to something good, you feel like all of your behavior is going to lead to something good, you're far more likely to take risks because I don't want to say that you're incapable of being rational, but the way that I see it is and we've spoken about Daniel Kahneman before, and System 1 and System 2, and the rational mind and the intuitive mind. And the intuitive mind is going to be driven by things like affect and emotion and feelings, and the rational mind is more about evidence and slowing down and thinking carefully. When you are manic, I think that your rational mind is capable, but it's like your emotional brain is on steroids. So it's so powerful that it sort of just overwhelms the rational. So your decisions start becoming very intuitive and very driven by this overwhelming sense of optimism that you have. So that leads to that sociability, because when you think of going and speaking to somebody, you think that this conversation is going to go incredibly well, that it's going to have positive consequences. When you think about getting involved in some sort of business, for example, you think it's obviously going to be successful, and so you're more likely to take chances with business decisions and that sort of thing. In my case, I certainly did some things that were relatively risky. So, for example, I resigned from the job that I was working at, which was a fairly impulsive thing to do because I didn't have a lot of money and I didn't have a backup plan. And I actually started working for the church, and at the time, I felt like a sense of financial omnipotence, which is also quite common. So often people that are manic will spend a huge amount of money. They'll run up credit cards because they kind of feel like the money will come, like it will all work out. That sense of optimism is quite overwhelming. So I was working for the church and I wasn't getting paid for it. I was retiling the floor in the church, St. Michael's in Earlsfield. or Southfields. I can't remember exactly where. And, if somebody asked me for money, I would, hand over £50, £100 to people without really giving it much thought. And I certainly wasn't wealthy at the time. Maybe just some other examples of that impulsivity. Maybe 2 days into the manic episode, I remember walking down a road in Earlsfield, which is where I was living, and I saw a tattoo shop just on my right-hand side. And without breaking stride and without ever having thought about getting a tattoo before, I walked and found a couple of things on the wall that I thought would be fine. And an hour later, I had them, down my arm and down my back. And I know that tattoos are relatively common these days, but I didn't come from anyone that I knew that had a tattoo in 2003. So those sorts of things are maybe some of the indicators. For about 3 months, I was pretty much in this state, and I was actually living with a person who I'd known since I was about 4 years old at the time. And I had other people around me that knew me quite well. And I was in a manic state, and that is the most elevated state of bipolar disorder. So if you think of kind of normal mood, you have a kind of state that we refer to as hypomania, which means below mania. And then above that, you'd have a state that you call mania. And that's the most extreme elevation in mood. And I'll get onto the diagnostic criteria after this. But I was manic. So it's not even like I was hypomanic. I was, fully manic. And I was, for 3 months, living with these people. And they definitely noticed that something was different. I wasn't revealing to them everything that was going on in my mind, and they could see that something was, not quite right, but they weren't worried enough about me, to get hold of my parents. I mean, I think I was 23 at the time, and just say, I think something's going on with John. So this idea that it's so blindingly obvious when somebody is bipolar is not really the case. These are people that knew me. So as you've mentioned, maybe some leaders of problematic groups might have had bipolar tendencies, or might have been experiencing mania or hypomania at various times. If you don't know what their baseline was like, then it becomes even more difficult to know whether the behavior is off or not, because the diagnosis of a mental disorder has got a lot to do with deviation from what is normal for that person.
Yeah.
So if you don't know what's normal for that person, then, it might just look like somebody who's incredibly confident, incredibly sure of themselves, has got a lot of ideas. In terms of the ideas thing, I think that's a very important thing as well, because hypergraphia, so excessive writing, and creativity are very closely associated with hypomania and mania. And there's a lot of research on that.
For our audience, to separate out these two confusing words, hypo and hyper. That
Yes.
Hypo is under, as in a hypodermic needle, which goes under the dermis, the skin. Hyper means above. Super and supra are similarly difficult. So,
yes. So hypo meaning below.
Yeah.
So hypomania, below mania, but above the normal range of mood.
Yeah.
So I started writing a book at the time, and I was just, your ability to focus when you are hypermanic or manic can be intense. So the symptom that they refer to in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is goal-directed behavior. So often people become incredibly motivated and focused on getting something done. It can be exercise. So some people really get into shape. It might be cleaning your house. It might be whatever. In my case, it was, I thought that this book was really important, that it was going to have these incredible consequences. So I was very focused on that and was very productive in that space. So again, people that are, end up leading particular groups often come up with their own doctrine. They come up with their own backstories and that sort of thing. And it's certainly plausible that when a person's in a hypermanic or a manic state, they will come up with these very interesting, connections between things and ideas that a person in a normal state or in a euthymic state would maybe not come up with.
Well, and let me interject that when Ron Hubbard got the idea for his book Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, I exchanged letters there on Tony Ortega's site with a man called Don Rogers, who was with Hubbard throughout that period. They were working together. And he said he was given a commission for the book by a medical publisher, Hermitage House. And what he'd been doing was hypnotizing people and getting remission of symptoms. Quite successfully. As far as I can tell, he'd worked with about 40 people. He was very insistent in the book that he'd worked with 273 people. That's not in fact true. But when the commission came through, he turned to this guy and said, well, deep trance hypnosis isn't popular, so I'm going to have to come up with something new. And in 3 weeks, he wrote a 400-page book. And it's a mess. It really is a mess. But it sold 150,000 copies and created a worldwide movement. And I would, I have the idea, he was later, I talked with somebody who was his secretary in 1954, and he said to her that it was actually dictated to him as automatic writing by his holy guardian angel, as the Crowleyites call it.
And that's kind of what it feels like. It does feel like you're possessed, and the stuff is just, you feel like you're that you're just a vessel that is being used. So you mentioned that in 3 weeks he wrote a book that was, what did you say, 400 pages long?
400-page book, yeah.
And you said it's quite a mess. So
there are many contradictions in it. He, for example, says that hypnotism was never used in the creation of Dianetics. And then later in the same book, he says it's completely based on my research in hypnotism. But there's such a barrage of ideas that when you read it, I mean, I read it 3 times and didn't notice these contradictions until I left and came back and looked at it.
So this is a book that I wrote just in December of 2011. So I started it on the 1st of December, and by the end of December, it was finished. And so just to give you a sense of the level of productivity, and I would say that I was hypomanic. I wouldn't say that I was fully manic. I was actually working a job, and so it was just during my free hours that I was doing this. So this book that I wrote is called The Walrus. So you can see that, okay, that's just part of it, all right? So then we've got that, and then we've got that, all right? Okay. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of it. It is single-sided, but I mean, just that gives you a sense of the level of hypergraphia, the level of just, being able to sit down and just focus on something and just write and write and write. And
of course, Ron Hubbard is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's most prolific author of all time. Now, I think there was a certain amount of cheating there, because much of his work is transcribed from lectures, and most of his books, in fact 27 out of 28 of them, were put together by editors. But nonetheless, he wrote, the amount of literature in Scientology. There are tens of volumes of executive directives, bulletins, policy letters. And when I said to somebody who'd worked with him that Hubbard was fat and lazy and extremely rude, he said he wasn't lazy. You could walk past the window of his cabin on the ship any day and he'd be sat there with some other idea. And it just pours forth. As to how relevant it is, one needs to be probably in a slightly lowered state of mind to understand what one has written and edit it and take
exactly back. Well, they often say with people that, and a lot of writers and novelists and poets have been bipolar in the past. There's a great book by Kay Redfield Jamison, who's a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. I don't know if she's still there. I know that she is getting she's getting on a bit, so she may be there. She may have retired now. So it was a 1993 book called Touched with Fire. And it's basically on the relationship between what she refers to as manic depressive illness, which is another name for bipolar disorder, and the artistic temperament.
Mm.
And really wonderful book, gives you a good sense of what bipolar disorder is about. And her later book in 1995 is a book, it's called An Unquiet Mind, which is her memoir. And that is often a book that's recommended to people who have been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, because it provides a more personal account of what the illness is like. So when you go to a psychiatrist, or if you read the DSM, it's very sort of dead, the way that they explain things. So they've got these symptoms, but it doesn't really capture what it's about. And even when I lecture abnormal psychology to third years, and when you do the lectures on bipolar disorder, you realize that they're getting a very distorted view of what the disorder is like, because they're hearing about the symptoms, but they're not hearing about how frequently those symptoms present, how long they can last, and some of the intricacies. I think it's a little bit sad that, in South Africa, for example, if you are diagnosed with bipolar disorder now, if somebody says to you, can you read An Unquiet Mind? It's a wonderful book, but you want to be able to read a book by somebody that you can identify with. And, a 75, 80-year-old woman living in Baltimore is not the person that a lot of young South Africans can identify with. So it would be great if there was an account that more people could maybe look at.
Well,
a lot of people that
publish
are
the
bipolar,
Walrus for people, surely.
I think it needs more editing than I'm willing to go through. A lot of people that are bipolar do write books, though, so they will write memoirs. But I think the thing that was fantastic about hers is that she is a professor of psychiatry and she's experienced it. So she's got that combination of the theoretical knowledge and the practical experience, and she's able to bring the two together, which is obviously very useful. Yeah.
And I mean, in the last decade, we've got used to this idea of neurodivergence. And I would put forward the idea that we're probably all of us neurodivergent, that we're different, and that there isn't this state of normal that was invented in the 1950s is not necessarily a desirable thing, because it is by bringing together people of different dispositions and different competences that we can make teams that do something effective. There is no single human type. As to what place there is for criminal psychopaths, probably prison, but most types of mind have something that can be said for them. And when we're dealing with bipolar and the 3 classified different forms of bipolar, to the extent that's true, then a tremendous amount of creative people. I mean, certainly after I'd first talked to you, I sort of went away and looked a little bit at bipolar, and of course you start going, do I have this condition? Because I do get very happy. I experience joy. And I think so far my self-diagnosis is I probably don't, but it does say that these can be very useful things. And I mean, what you say about the balance of reason and emotion within us, if we look at our minds as predictive, that what we're trying to do is work out what's going to happen next and act effectively towards it, that's the point where having our reasoning balanced with our intuition becomes very important, because to be just cold and calculating in the world, you're not actually going to see what's going to happen, because you're not going to understand the emotions of other people. And that's perhaps the most significant idea in dealing with other people is feeling what they're feeling, getting some sense of that. And that puts us into the neurodivergence that is labeled autism, which is, who knows where we're going to be in 10 years' time in the study of that condition. So I think it's very important to find that balance. And when we feel, I long time talking with people who've become involved in authoritarian cults, you get high, you get euphoric, you feel transcendence, and pointing out the techniques that are used, like meditation, where you're staring at something, will actually induce physiological conditions. So what you feel is God inside you is actually something, there's a wonderful account of a woman who grew up in East Germany in an atheist state. She was a communist, and because she was a communist, she spent, I think, 14 years in prison, because communism was the last thing anybody was meant to believe in East Germany, or in the Warsaw Pact countries. And she devised a system of meditation with no basis at all in religious teaching, and describes experiences that are exactly the same experiences that are talked about by Christian, Sufi, Buddhist, Hindu mystics. Her experiences, there's a book called The Common Experience by Cohen and Phipps, which talks about the varieties of religious experience, and talks about her experience. So we experience different states, and we then attribute meanings to them, and that can be quite dangerous. And if bipolar is something that can bring about a creative state, then that's a good thing if we can keep it balanced, and if the person suffering from the disorder is able to live successfully in the world, to live comfortably in the world.
And I think that what you're saying is so relevant. I would say that, obviously, the analogy I might use, I don't know how familiar everyone is with Asterix and Obelix, but that's kind of how I think of it. So people with bipolar disorder,
of course,
so people with bipolar disorder are kind of like Obelix, who just naturally will experience these highs and that kind of thing, whereas other people require, whether it's pharmacological inputs, or whether they require some sort of really stressful experience or some sort of meditation or whatever, they can enter into those same spaces, but it requires more efforts on their part. So the person who's bipolar is going to experience those hypermanic and manic states kind of, I don't want to say entirely without external factors, but it can be without external factors. Do you think it will be useful to maybe just speak about the diagnosis? So how a person is diagnosed, then from there we can speak about the treatments and that sort of thing. So you've mentioned that there are 3 major types of bipolar disorder. Sometimes they speak about 2 different types. It affects about 1 to 2% of the population, depending on how you define it. But the 2 major types of bipolar disorder are bipolar disorder 1 and bipolar disorder 2. And the major difference between the 2 is that in bipolar disorder 1, the person will have experienced mania, which is the full high elevated state. It's as high as you can be. And we'll run through the symptoms afterwards. They don't need to have experienced depression. So what would be diagnosed as normal major depressive disorder or depressive episode lasting at least 2 weeks, they don't have to have had that happen in order to be diagnosed as bipolar 1. As long as they've experienced mania, they can be diagnosed. It's very common for people who experience mania to also experience depression, but it doesn't always happen. Bipolar 2 is the form of the disorder where the person doesn't experience full-blown mania, they only experience hypomania, and they also have to have had a depressive episode lasting for at least 2 weeks for them to be diagnosed with bipolar 2. The manic episode in bipolar 1 has to last for at least a week. So some people think that that's the typical length that they last. It's not. My manic episode was 3 months. It was untreated. But frequently it can be weeks or months at a time that you're in an elevated state or in a depressive state. With a hypomanic episode, it's got to be at least 4 days long. The only difference between hypomania and mania, according to a lot of the literature, is the severity of the symptoms. So if the symptoms are causing you dysfunction in life, or if they lead to hospitalization, then it will be diagnosed as mania. If they are mild enough that they are noticeable, but they aren't causing significant difficulties in your life, then it'll be diagnosed as hypomania. Before we get onto the specific symptoms, one would think that this disorder that involves these fluctuations in mood would be incredibly easy to diagnose. What the literature shows is that the average delay between first symptoms and diagnosis is about 8 years. So there's this really long period of time between when a person first experiences symptoms and when the diagnosis happens. In my case, it happened very quickly. I mean, it was 3 months after the symptoms, but I was lucky enough to have very extreme symptoms. So when I went into the psychologist during the depressive phase, and I said, this is what's been going on, this is what I've been doing, this is what I've been thinking, he just showed me the page from the DSM, and I could tick every one of the categories in terms of things that I'd been doing and thinking and feeling. Often it's the case with people with bipolar 2 that they don't report on the elevation in mood. So typically people will go to a psychologist or psychiatrist when they are depressed, and they find it difficult to even remember that they were elevated at some point, or the elevation felt good, but it didn't feel so good that they were aware of it at the time. So when people are manic or hypermanic, it's far more likely that other people will notice it than they will notice it as something problematic.
And because with bipolar 2 that they will present with depression, they'll often be misdiagnosed as depressive and given selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, which will actually not be helpful in my limited
Well, not only
experience.
not helpful, it might push them into a manic episode. So if we'll get onto the medications for bipolar disorder, but you want to regulate mood. You don't want it to go too high and you don't want it to go too low. So if you misdiagnose the person as having major depressive disorder or depressive disorder, and you give them antidepressants have been identified as one of those things that might push people into hypermanic and manic states. So that's obviously not a good thing. In terms of the DSM criteria for diagnosis of a manic episode or a hypermanic episode, the difference being the severity and the time period, but it's the same symptoms. Basically, they speak about an elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. So that's a given. So elevated mood, feeling really good, a lot of joy, euphoria, that kind of thing. Expansive, meaning wanting to engage with everyone. So feeling incredibly like you just want to, as opposed to when you're depressed, just wanting to sit in your room and not engage with anyone. People that are manic tend to just want to engage with the world and speak to everyone, often reveal their thoughts quite freely without having much of a filter, and might say things that they wouldn't otherwise say, that sort of thing. So elevated, expansive, or irritable. So frequently people that are bipolar might get irritable, and it can lead to aggression as well. But if you think about it, you're dealing with a person who's effectively got their foot on the accelerator and their revs are sitting at 9,000 and they're just ready to go the whole time. So they are going to be impatient. They're likely to react to things in a particular way. I don't think that I was particularly irritable, and it's not a prerequisite. I was more just euphoric and just happy and joyful. But certainly there have been times where I felt irritable under other circumstances.
I mean, it's really interesting, again, because many of my viewers are former Scientologists or Scientology watchers. One of the most reported behaviors of Ron Hubbard was his tremendous temper, and that he would scream and shout at people, what is called a severe reality adjustment, or SRA. Something I learned about very late on in my time in Scientology, which I found very off-putting, that he'd go an inch or two away from somebody's face and really set about destroying them, destroying any confidence they hadn't in themselves. And this got worse and worse. The more isolated he was with his entourage, the nastier he became towards them. So that, I didn't know that irritability would, is also one of the symptoms. And he was also somebody who was, as you say, expansive. He was somebody who loved to have people around him and would communicate with them until such time as they annoyed him, which seemed to happen on a daily basis for years.
And I think it's like anything. And we mentioned this when we spoke about Kanye West or Ye, or I'm not sure what he refers to himself now as. When we spoke about that in the other episode, it's always going to be a combination of the person and the people that they're around and other factors. So obviously L. Ron Hubbard's not somebody who had to really restrict his behavior. There was no incentive for him to control himself. He could get away with it, and therefore you're going to see that sort of behavior being more extreme than it would otherwise be. I mean, there's an association with bipolar disorder and aggression, and this is something that I like to bring up because it reveals the problem with only giving part of the information. So if you look at the rates of aggression with bipolar disorder, they are higher than the general population, and it might even be double the general population in terms of likelihood of being arrested for assault or something like that. And the researchers that found this out, there was a study in 2010, I can't remember exactly who did it, but the same researchers found that if you remove alcohol from the equation, or if you remove substance abuse from the equation, then the rates of aggression among people with bipolar disorder is exactly the same as the general population. So people with bipolar disorder have got a very high propensity for substance use disorders, and we can speak about the reasons for that. But it's not the bipolar disorder itself that is causing the aggression. The bipolar disorder leads to or some of the same characteristics lead to a high risk of substance use, and substance use leads to aggression. So in my case, I might have, half a sip of a glass of wine every few weeks or something like that. So to apply those findings to people that are not abusing substances is not really fair. So you need to understand those kind of details.
So you're more vulnerable to alcohol. And of course, alcohol is generally, there are happy drunks, there are, morbid drunks, and there are aggressive drunks. But alcohol is a drug and presumably there will be specific substances. Would there be any association between cannabis use, for example, which usually calms people down?
So,
if there
is some research that shows that certain people have got a predisposition that if they smoke marijuana or if they use marijuana, it can lead to psychosis, and it can be very problematic. It's a small subset of the population, but they might,
cannabis
interact
psychosis
with it once or twice and have that effect. It's found that it's not useful as a treatment for bipolar disorder. So it may be useful to help people sleep, and managing sleep is very useful for managing bipolar disorder. But it doesn't have any effect on reducing manic or hypomanic symptoms or reducing depressive symptoms. The only thing that it might be useful for is managing sleep, but there are other ways to manage sleep.
I think that there is a broader conversation about this, but it's not what we're directly going to. Is just whether there's any evidence, because we're talking about substance abuse, it's whether it is specific substances like alcohol, which it would be, cannabis, because it's not generally, in fact, it's associated with non-violence for the most part, as to whether you're aware of any material that's saying that it might increase aggressive tendencies. One would imagine that amphetamines might, or cocaine might. Things that
so the ones that are elevating dopamine or that act upon the dopamine pathways, and I haven't looked at the detail, but based on the fact that there's the dopamine hypothesis of bipolar disorder, that it seems that pathway plays a role in mania. And when you look at people with bipolar disorder, the rates of substance use disorders among people with bipolar 1 is over 60%,
right,
which is really, really high. And with bipolar 2, I think it's a little under 50%, which is far higher than the general population. So I don't know the breakdown of what those substance uses, what the substances are, but that's kind of what it looks like. So when I say it's very common in bipolar disorder, it's very common. So you've got an elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. That's the starting point, and also a marked increase in energy. So you see a person that has just got far more energy than they would normally have. That's the starting point. And then they basically say, if the mood is elevated and expansive, then you also need 3 of the following 7 symptoms. And if it's just irritable, then you need also 4 of the following 7 symptoms. And I don't know how they came up with these sorts of things. It obviously is problematic. There's subjectivity kind of going into it. But I think, and for people that kind of question psychiatric diagnoses and the fact that it's not using blood tests and that sort of thing, we have to understand our brain is made up of 90 billion neurons, each connected with 1,000 other neurons, sending trillions of connections all over the place. You know, we can understand what's wrong with our bodies if we break a bone or we tear a hamstring, but a bone or a hamstring through a scan is a giant thing to look at. And you go, oh, there's a tear over there. It's pretty simple to understand. To understand what's going on in the brain is incredibly complicated. So at the moment, our best way of understanding it is by speaking through symptoms, and they tend to cluster together. And that's what the diagnoses are based on. So you might get people that are being diagnosed with bipolar disorder that look quite different to each other. And there probably are a lot of problems with the diagnosis. And the fact that there's an 8-year delay between first symptoms and diagnosis suggests that it is a complicated and difficult thing to do. But that doesn't mean that there can't be problems with your brain. I mean, the fact that we can have problems with every other part of our body, our brains are far more complicated. Obviously, things can go wrong. And so we're trying to make sense of these things that are going wrong. We notice that certain things tend to occur together, and that's what is being called various disorders. I think some of them are overdiagnosed. I think some of them are problematic, but that's the thinking behind it. So in addition to those things, we've got what I remember as the 3 S's of bipolar disorder. So sleep is the one thing. So people can get away with very little sleep over long periods of time. So I went for 9 days without sleep. It's common for people that are manic to spend a week without sleeping at all. After that, for the next 3 months, or what was the remainder of 3 months, I was probably sleeping 1 hour a night, 2 hours a night, and waking up feeling completely refreshed, ready to go. No problem at all. I didn't feel like I was tired. I didn't feel like I was missing out on sleep. And so that's quite common. The second S is speech. So what you have is pressured speech in a person who's hypermanic or manic. And I think that anyone who's been around, and even now, I feel like my speech is a little bit pressured. So sometimes the words feel like they formed in my mind before I'm able to get them out of my mouth. And I think anyone who's
get
spent
them out
time
fast enough.
Exactly. So your mind is working so quickly that you can't articulate the speed of your thoughts. If you've spent time with people that are taking cocaine and they just will talk to you nonstop and just will not be able to keep quiet, that's a fairly good comparison in terms of that element of pressured speech. So it's reflective of a lot going on in the mind of somebody with bipolar disorder. Okay. The third S is self-esteem. So this is about confidence. This is about, and in hypomania, it's feeling really confident, feeling like you can achieve anything, feeling like you can take on the world. In mania, it is grandiosity. And then you start getting delusions of grandeur. So, you know, you may, for example, think that God has given you a special mission, or that you are the second coming, or something along those lines. And
again, in the case of Ron Hubbard, there are many statements, but one of the things he said is that his was the first real development in human thought in 50,000 years.
Yeah. And I mean, there'll be people who think that they're going to be winning a Pulitzer or the Nobel Prize, even though they haven't done anything yet. They're kind of like, I've got it up here and it's going to happen. And again, and I just, so people kind of understand this, I'm hoping that I'm coming across as being relatively rational, that I don't
so far
obviously like a person who's severely mentally ill. There've been 3 occasions that I've thought that I was the second coming. And you might say to me, well, how is that possible? You seem very rational. You seem like you can think critically. And it's very difficult to explain. But all that I can kind of say is that when your mood is so elevated, your thoughts become aligned with that mood, and that mood is really not normal. I think depression is a difficult thing to communicate to people, and the stigma around depression is often people think, oh, come on, just get over it. You know, it can't be that bad, because it involves a lack of activity. There's psychomotor retardation, there's a withdrawal, and people kind of think, well, I could also be withdrawn, so therefore whatever.
And there's a tremendous confusion in our culture between unhappiness or reactive depression and endogenous depression, depression that's coming from the inside. If you know it's a drizzling, dreary day out there, and you go out and look at it and you don't feel happy, that's fine. But if it's a lovely sunny day and everything's going your way and you just have no energy, you have no desire, no motivation left, then you're dealing with endogenous depression, real depression, and telling somebody to snap out of it is not in the least bit helpful.
Yeah, I mean, in Jamison's book, Touched with Fire, she gives these wonderful examples from artists and novelists and poets. So Edgar Allan Poe, she quotes from him. She quotes Leo Tolstoy as well. Both of them were depressive and bipolar. It certainly seems in the case with Poe. And both of them say something to the effect of, I can recognize that my life is good. I can see that things are getting better. Tolstoy was like, I've got a fantastic family, amazing children, people love me. You know, my estate is growing without me even having to do anything about it. But every day I have to kind of take the rope out of my reach so I don't hang myself. When I go outside, I must make sure I leave the gun so I don't rid myself of life.
And with Tolstoy, one of the first movies that we have, one of the first films, is the last day of Tolstoy's life. He was filmed, and he's a very old man by this time, who, as you say, he's the most successful writer in Russia. There's no competition. He is loved and applauded. But on the last day of his life, we see him at a railway station because he's run away from his wife. And he died that day. So it's a really strange thing. Spike can maybe find that little bit of film and give us a link to it. That despite his incredible success, he nonetheless did not have, you know, a stable opinion of himself or a feeling about his place in the world. And again, it's true to say with Ron Hubbard that I interviewed or corresponded, was in touch with many people who over the years talked about the terrible depression he would fall into. His girlfriend, Barbara Cloden, in 1950, when he was had a bigamous wife and was going for a third wife. Is that trigamy? I'm not sure. Trigonometry. But she said he would spend 4 days in bed just drinking and until it saying what a failure he was. There was a nurse called Jim Dincalci, well, a man who nursed him called Jim Dincalci in 72, 73, who talked about this, you know, how withdrawn and depressed he would be. John McMaster, who was the world's first real clear in Scientology, when I interviewed him, he said, you know, he'd have these awful periods of despair. And yet publicly, of course, and at the end of his life, he asked this guy, Sarge Fouth, to make an electrical machine that would kill him, and said, you know, I've achieved nothing. My work is completely worthless, which I think is very close to the truth. But that this quite overwhelming, you know, and then, you know, he'll go out on the stage and tell people, oh, I'm the most brilliant man who ever lived, you know?
So, and I mean, I think that is the nature of mood disorders, is that your sense of yourself and your worth and the future and that sort of thing doesn't line up with what objective evidence would tell you. And what I was saying is, with depression, it's often difficult to communicate to people because they might look and say, well, I could also have no energy. So but with mania, when you say to people, I was awake for 9 days, if you know what I mean, that's something that you can say to people, well, good luck. You try to do that. You know, that shows that there's something very extreme going on that's shifting the way that you see things. And it's a proxy for everything else. So that is just showing the level of energy, but that also reflects the level of euphoria, the level of confidence, the level of all the other things that are part of and parcel of that elevated state. But it's the one that you can kind of see quite easily, and that's easy to sort of measure. So you've got that self-esteem. The next one is flight of ideas. So this is really, I mean, I think that this relates to creativity, but it's also a sense of, I mean, the next one is distractibility. So flight of ideas and distractibility. So there's a lot of information coming through. And in terms of creativity, there have been studies that have looked at people that are manic and compared them to controls. And if you give them a word and you ask them to find a word association, they'll come up with 3 times as many words. And in terms of the novelty of those words, there'll be the level of novelty will also be a lot greater. So the number of common words will drop by about 1/3. Wow. So if you know what I mean. So there's this ability to kind of find links between things that other people would not normally find. And if you see that link between creativity and psychosis, you realize that there's a thin sort of bridge between being highly creative and then having thoughts that are so creative that only you understand how the connections are being made. So there's that quote by John Dryden, who said, "Great wits are sure to madness near allied, and thin partitions to their bounds divide." And that idea of people being this fine line between genius and madness is sometimes the case with bipolar disorder. And, I don't want to overstate this.
Because the other side of it is, and this is something because from childhood I've been creative. I started painting when I was about 10 and started writing when I was about 13. And it was such a frequent idea in the culture that if you were creative, you were going to go mad at any minute. And this thought plagued me well into my 20s. And having now studied the lives of hundreds of artists and authors, it is true for somebody who has bipolar disorder, but thankfully it is not true that if you are creative, you are on the razor's edge and on the verge.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, so what the data shows is what should be really obvious, is that a higher proportion of people with bipolar disorder are in the artistic professions than a proportion of people that are not bipolar, but a far greater proportion of all artists and novelists and whatever are not bipolar or have depressive disorder. It just means that a greater proportion of the 1 or 2% of people that have bipolar disorder are in those sorts of professions than of the 98% of people that don't.
Some years ago, I read an estimation that said that depression is very common among writers. Which I can understand why, because they
comedians as well.
Have to deal with publishers. But in fact, sculptors were held to have the lowest of any category of people, and it was this lovely thought that if you get to smack things and mold things and do that temperament, it's less likely you'll have lower than the normal rate for depression. This was specifically depression. But as you say, with bipolar people making up 1 to 2%, and then making up 5% of artists rather than just 1 or 2%.
All right. So then we've got distractibility and this ability to link ideas. So the idea of distractibility is that you might be focused on something, then kind of move on to something else. But that's quite in contrast to one of the other ones, which is the next one, which was goal-directed behavior, which is hyper-focus on one thing for a long period of time. So it can be one or the other. In my case, it seems to be more the goal-directed behavior, less than the distractibility.
Yeah, I've not noticed that you're in the least bit distractible in our conversations, which is great.
And in terms of flight of ideas, sometimes it can be, and I think that this is something that's not picked up, is that if you are thinking creatively, then you might shift the topic to something else that in your mind is related, but to the other person may not seem related. And I think that that's something that is missed. So it's this flight of ideas can be, from an external perspective, it seems like it's a flight of ideas, but to the person, it may seem not the case.
Again, to footnote on Ron Hubbard, he notoriously, he left us more than 3,000 recorded lectures. And anybody who's listened to these lectures, he will have a topic. He would usually start by saying, "What day is it?" And I came to realize ultimately that's because he had no idea. and
Yeah.
then he announces the topic, and then he starts telling a story. And for half an hour, he tells these stories, often very similar stories. And then he may or may not return to the topic. And you come
Yeah.
away and you think, is this some kind of, Zen insight that we've
Yeah.
been given? Is there something profound happening here? And then you come back and say, no, he was just telling stories, because that's where
Yeah.
he was very distractible.
Yeah. Just to follow up with a little bit of self-promotion, and I think it's a good example, and it relates to LGATs as well. So in 2012, I had heard that the author of Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk, was a supporter of one of the major large group awareness trainings. And that annoyed me a little bit because I enjoyed the film, and I was like, okay, well, let me go and watch the movie. So I'd taken part in an LGAT in 2010. So for 2 years, I'd studied it quite intensely. I knew all the people involved, the characters, that sort of thing. But while I started watching the movie in this sort of hypermanic state, so quite a creative state, quite a state that I was able to make quite loose associations between various things, I started noticing that there were a lot of parallels between the large group awareness training industry and characters and things that were going on in the movie. And so I thought to myself, oh, that's really interesting. So the first thing I noticed, for example, was that the main antagonist, or the main person kind of working against the narrator, is Marla Singer, and the person who wrote Cults in Our Midst is Dr. Margaret Singer. So I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then I started noticing similarities with the way that the groups were being run. So you've got these rules, and the first rule is that you can't speak about you can't talk about Fight Club, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And I was like, well, at the beginning of LGATs, they run through a bunch of rules, and the first rule is that you can't tell anyone about what goes on in them. That's kind of interesting. Then I knew that Werner Erhard lived in Franklin Street, and at the beginning of the movie and at the end of the movie, it's in Franklin Street. So Edward Norton looks up at a bus shelter and you see Franklin Street. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then the first CEO of Est was Stuart Emery. And between two scenes, Emery Street flashes on the thing. And I was like, is this just coincidence or what's going on? Then you've got this group of volunteers who live in the house and are cleaning the pots and pans and are doing all this sort of thing. And having read Stephen Pressman's book about Werner Erhard, it speaks about these armies of volunteers that used to live at Franklin House with Erhard and clean all the pots and pans and all this. And I was like, okay, that's really interesting as well. And then they speak about, Tyler Durden, and Edward Norton faces the camera and he says, Tyler worked as a banquet waiter at the luxurious Pressman Hotel. And it's like, well, Stephen Pressman was the guy who wrote the biography on Werner Erhard. And after that, my mind just started really kind of running. And then I watched it again and again and again, that goal-directed behavior sort of thing. And I was like, he's definitely commenting on it. I mean, we know that he took part in one of these things in 1989. And, all of these things that he's commenting on. And so I came up with an explanation of what the commentary was about. And I went to my psychologist the next day and I sat in front of her and I said, I've managed to find a hidden meaning in this movie, Fight Club. And I mean, obviously her reaction was, okay, John, that's really nice, and sort of started writing something down on her pad. And I kind of left it for 5 years. And then at the end of my PhD, because I had provided such a strong background of LGATs, I decided to just include as an appendix, this relationship between LGATs and Fight Club. And again, I don't think anyone really read it. And then in 2019, I got hold of a guy who's running a website on David Fincher, so all of his movies. And I just sort of rewrote the essay and I sent it through to him, kind of thinking maybe I'm crazy, because I think that's a useful thing to think if you have bipolar disorder, to be quite introspective about some of these ideas that you might have. And he got back to me, he said, this is amazing, it makes complete sense. And he's published it and it's illustrated, and everyone that's read it now is like, yeah, without a doubt, this is definitely what's going on. It doesn't seem crazy at all. And I think that that's quite a nice, and I call it Elgatz and Fight Club dissecting a delusion, because at the time, everyone thought that I was delusional when I tried to explain it to anyone. And I think the point of me explaining that is that when you're in this hypermanic state, you are able to see things in quite an interesting way.
Yeah.
But possibly to outsiders, your thinking may seem psychotic or delusional or crazy. And a lot of the time, maybe it is. But sometimes it might just be that you're seeing connections that they don't have the context to necessarily see.
Yeah, because of the highly energized way in which your mind works, that there's a speed of connection that, and it's worth saying again that things that are considered to be disorders can be entirely useful. Talking of Russian novelists, for me, the greatest of them that I've read is Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's syndrome is now called temporal lobe epilepsy. He had a terrible time of it. He would get money, incredibly successful. He'd get money for a book and he'd gamble it away straight away and have to write another book, which was really lucky for us, because it could otherwise have been like, say, Ralph Ellison, he wrote one book and that was all you got. So with Dostoevsky, because he had to make money because he had this gambling addiction, which was certainly part of his condition. And it's called Dostoevsky syndrome because he described it in the novel The Idiot. So we have this usefulness of the condition that James Thurber, the humorist, had Charbonnet syndrome, where you see halos around everything and have this exalted feeling, and gave us Walter Mitty out of that. So these differences, I like the concept of neurodivergence. I've got no time for the concept of being neurotypical. I've no idea what that would be, but seeing that you can have a different perception of the world because of your condition. And at that point, I have problems with the term disorder. I think the term syndrome is more friendly. I have delayed sleep-wake disorder, because my clock is set to fall asleep at sort of 4 a.m. and wake at noon. In the last few years, it's gone from this being, about less than 2% of people have this. We're now hearing about 30% of us have it. And about 40% have a fixed advanced phase and have to go to sleep early and get up early. And then there's another 30% who can move their clock successfully. So the idea of this being a disorder, and having been lectured by one of the great expert sleep clinicians telling me that we don't live at the normal time of day. And it's like, well, who defines normal? How dare you tell me that I'm abnormal because I don't fit in with that? And so, it takes every kind of people, as the song says, to make the world go round. And so you have both a disability or a set of disabilities and a concomitant set of abilities that come with that. So who else will look at Fight Club and see this? That's incredible. We will put a link. And let me
I would like that, and I'd like to see what people have to say about it. I think it's fairly convincing.
And let me just point out that an LGAT is a large group awareness training, like Earhart seminar training, just in case anybody watching has got stuck on that term. It's
well, if they read,
you get a group of people
the
together and do horrible things.
I provide enough context for them to kind of read it blind and be able to kind of understand enough about it to understand the relationships.
Absolutely.
So the final symptom is pleasure or impulsivity. So this what you see in people is following pleasureful activities at a rate that they wouldn't normally do. So it's taking risks, it's impulsive behavior. It can lead to very bad things. So it can lead to taking risks sexually. So if you're in a relationship, that can be problematic if you are not managing that sort of thing.
Not remembering to
It
use a
can-
condom.
Exactly. So it can lead to further things like STIs and pregnancies and that sort of thing that people later regret. So it feels like this is a good idea at the time, and then it can lead to problems. So we have spoken about some of these things as positives. These, you'd have to have elevated, expansive, or irritable mood with increase in energy, and then 3 of those 7 symptoms, which is no need for sleep, excessive speech, increased self-esteem, flight of ideas, distractibility, goal-directed behavior, and then impulsivity. You'd need 3 of those additional symptoms, or 4 if your mood was just irritable, in order for the diagnosis to be made. It would have to last for at least a week and be very severe, causing problems in your life, to be diagnosed with mania, and then therefore bipolar 1, or at least 4 days and lower level of the same symptoms to be diagnosed with bipolar 2. But you'd also need to have a depressive episode lasting at least 2 weeks to be diagnosed with bipolar 2, whereas bipolar 1, you only need the mania. You mentioned that there were 3 major types of bipolar disorder. We also might speak of cyclothymia.
Cyclothymia, yeah.
So that would be long-term symptoms that don't quite meet the criteria of mania or of full-blown depression. So maybe hypomanic symptoms and low-level depression lasting, I think it's for about 2 years, and then you might be diagnosed with cyclothymia. And then they've also got bipolar disorder not otherwise specified, which might, so I don't necessarily know whether those necessarily are always going to be treated. But I think it is important to mention the downside of the disorder, because I've spent a lot of time talking about, it increases creativity. And, there was a study in 2010 in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute, where they looked at 400,000 people, because they've got access to a lot of records in Sweden. People that at high school scored A results, so the top students, were 4 times as likely to develop bipolar disorder than people that scored average results. Also, the people that scored below average results, and I can't remember how they defined that, were twice as likely to develop it. So that seems to suggest that if people are, their conclusion was that high levels of intelligence are associated with bipolar disorder. But
well,
also
my conclusion would
low
be
levels,
high ability in passing exams would be. Intelligence to me is not something that's measured very much by examinations. But and in a system, of course, in Scandinavia, where examinations, it's not like the US where you're being hammered with SATs all the time, and the same in this country now. Exams are unusual in all of the Scandinavian systems. They don't do that. But one can understand that somebody who thinks faster is probably going to get their exam paper done on time, whereas somebody who processes more slowly is not. But it's an interesting correlation, and one that should be explored further, definitely.
Well, I mean, it's also the case that most people that are diagnosed may be diagnosed by the time they're finished high school, but I think the median age of diagnosis is about 25.
Yeah.
So they are not necessarily displaying any symptoms of bipolar disorder at that stage, but they've got that propensity to become bipolar later on, or to develop the disorder later on.
And there's that distinction between people who are born or develop the disorder very early on in life, and people who that dangerous period in later adolescence, around about 18 or 19, which is also true for schizophrenia often, that it will just come out of nowhere at the person.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the heritability of the disorder, bipolar disorder, in terms of what used to be called the axis 1 disorders, so bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder is the most genetic of all the disorders. So to give you a sense of that, if one identical twin has got major depressive disorder, there's about a 10 to 20% chance that the other identical twin will have major depressive disorder.
Right.
If an identical twin has, I think it's 10 to 20%, or maybe 20 to 40% chance that the other twin will have major depressive disorder. With bipolar disorder, it's between 40 and 70%.
Yeah.
So, and that's higher than depression. It's also higher than schizophrenia. So there's a very big genetic component to it. And during diagnosis, something that a clinician should ask you about is family history. So, I mean, my psychologist did ask me. The problem with this is that a lot of our families have not come from an era where people were diagnosed with anything. So I asked my parents, I was like, well, did we have any depression or bipolar disorder in our family? And they said, no, not as far as we know. And then later on, I was like, but, didn't your brother kill himself? And my dad was like, oh, yeah, that is true. And then my mom was like, oh, my uncle killed himself as well. I'm like, well, that is a pretty good indicator that there was some mood disorders kind of going on. So, there is that genetic component, but you have to be able to find those answers. And in the same way that you might not diagnose bipolar disorder because you failed to ask the person whether there was an elevation in mood. So you might leave it at depression because you haven't been able to go and find the right information. Okay, so maybe just speaking about some of the negative side of things, probably about 60 to 70% of people with bipolar disorder who have experienced serious symptoms, so maybe have been hospitalized at some point, are not working to their full capacity. So they're not fully employed. They're doing something that they feel is not quite what they could be doing. And I've certainly been through times where I felt like that. So I've been very lucky to have a very supportive family and, wonderful family who's been able to kind of support me when I've been in difficult circumstances. But there've been times where I've thought, with the way my mind is shut down, I don't think that I can do anything. Even the decision to go into academics as opposed to carrying on working in finance, which is what I was, what my initial degree was in, was to some degree because I felt that working in academics would have more structure, maybe more time to relax, although that hasn't really been shown to be the case entirely. And so managing myself has been involved, changing careers because that's how important it was. Rates of suicide and bipolar disorder are really, really high. So the suicide attempt rates, about 50% of people with bipolar disorder attempt suicide at some point in their lives. About 15 to 20% of people with bipolar disorder die by suicide. And that is terrible. Far higher than what you'll see in the general population. The suicide attempt rate in bipolar disorder, based on a big study in 1998, is double that of unipolar depression. So people with normal depression, which you associate just with the worst sadness and hopelessness that you can think of, the suicide attempt rate in bipolar disorder is double that. And I'm not sure exactly of what the reasons for that are. I think some of it may have to do with the fact that when you're manic, you can really wreck your life. You can, as I've said, spend money, get yourself into huge amounts of debt, get fired from your job, cheat on your husband or wife, get somebody pregnant, pick up an STI. Those are things that can happen if you don't manage the disorder properly. And then when you come down from that high and you realize the harm that you've caused, the level of regret it's quite overwhelming. So I've done things that are not nearly, that difficult to kind of come back from, I guess is the way to explain it. And I've had people to kind of catch me if I've spent too much. I've always had that financial support and that sort of thing. But you feel incredibly bad about things that you've maybe said or done. To give you an example, in 2020, I had, what I would say was my third manic episode. And that's the other thing. They're not nearly as common as people think they are. So from 2003 to 2020, I had my third one in 2020, after a very stressful period in my life. And there had been academics around the world that I'd been engaging with, and the way that I engaged with them over that period was very disrespectful. I was frustrated by the fact that they weren't paying attention to what was going on with large group awareness trainings, and that everyone seemed to just be indifferent. And I just spoke my mind, and I just said, this is, needless to say, these are people that, one of them was my master's supervisor. There were some professors at Stanford who'd been very kind to me in the past. There'd been another professor from my university who had met with me and had been wonderfully kind to me. And even though they know the context under which it occurred, and I apologized afterwards, the response is kind of very much like, I'd rather not engage with this person. And it's kind of understandable, but it's the regret that comes with that behavior is quite immense. And so this is kind of where I want to start talking about managing the disorder, because it is so important to manage, because you don't want those sorts of things to happen. You don't want to ruin your relationships. You don't want to ruin your career. You want to make sure that you're as effective as possible, given the challenge of the disorder. So before we get onto that, and I am being a bit distractible here,
Okay.
but just one or two other things that I think are misconceptions about the disorder. So when you see memes online about bipolar disorder, the sense that people think that people with bipolar disorder are just bouncing up and down, 1 minute they're like this, 1 minute they're up, 1 minute they're down. The reality of it is that if it's not at least a week, then it's not a manic episode. And generally, those episodes can last for months at a time. Okay. And also the depressive elements, also months at a time. So we've got something in bipolar disorder called rapid cycling. So 1 out of 8 people, based on the research that I've looked at with bipolar disorder, rapid cycles. This means that they experience 4 or more mood episodes in a year, in 12 months. So this idea of, 1 day up, 1 day down, whatever, that would be, 365 mood episodes in a year. So 1 out of 8 has 4 or more mood episodes in a year. Most people have 1 mood episode about once every year and a half or 2 years, but that episode may last for a long period of time. Something else that's maybe worth addressing is bipolar 1 versus bipolar 2. So sometimes people think, well, bipolar 2, that sounds like the milder version. It's not as bad. The thing that you need to know about bipolar 2 is that people that are bipolar 2 spend a lot more of their time in depressive states than people that are bipolar 1. And so that can be very difficult to deal with. So just because the mania isn't as high in bipolar 2 doesn't mean that the disorder is easier to deal with. So I think that that's something worth noting as well. Yeah. In terms of treatment, what I say when I've given workshops is the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to be comfortable with the diagnosis, because if you're not comfortable with the diagnosis, when you feel okay, and there are long periods of what's called euthymia. So about 50% of the time, people are not manic or depressed. They're kind of in a normal mood. When you're feeling okay, or if you're feeling hypermanic, people often go off their medication, and they often, reject the diagnosis. So it is a complicated diagnosis to make. I would suggest going to at least 2 clinicians and being very comfortable that the diagnosis is right. So that would be my starting point. In terms of treatments, there's therapy and there's medication. Bipolar disorder is one of those disorders that you can't treat it with therapy alone. And people have tried to do it, and the literature is that it doesn't work. And this is not just psychiatrists trying to medicate people. And I realize that is probably an issue to some degree. Because when you look at other disorders, they'll say, well, depression responds incredibly well to therapy, and anxiety responds very well to CBT and that sort of thing. Bipolar disorder, if you try to treat it just with therapy, it tends to work out very badly. Okay, so the first line of treatment is to go and see a psychiatrist, make sure the diagnosis is right, and then they will try to get you on the right medications.
Yep.
That can be a tricky thing. You can be lucky, you can be unlucky. So the first medication that's often used is lithium.
Yep.
So this has been around since 1949. I think there was an Australian psychiatrist who found out that it was very useful. I know in the US, the FDA didn't allow its use for 20 years, but now that is the first treatment that they will try on you. Some people don't respond to it well, and there are side effects. It's also toxic if in too high quantities. So you have to have your blood tested fairly regularly. There's a therapeutic range. So they don't want it higher than a certain level. They don't want it lower than a certain level. But if it's at a certain range, it tends to work pretty well. And there are thousands of journal articles written about lithium, how it works, whether it works, all that kind of thing. So there's quite a lot of research on it. If lithium doesn't work, then, or even if it does work, it may be supplemented with two other major groups of medications. The other major group is anti-epileptic medication. So those are medications that are often given to people that are having seizures that reduce brain activity or prevent brain activity from getting out of control. And they found that a lot of these medications tend to work quite well with bipolar disorder. You find with a lot of those medications that they lead to a lot of weight gain. Lithium can cause headaches. It can cause problems with libido. There can be a sort of dulling of your sense of reality. My experience of lithium has been that initially it is quite difficult, but over time it's become not only tolerable, but when I've gone off it, which was only in 2020, that was the only time I've gone off it when I was manic. I just felt completely out of control. My mind was just going at 1,000,000 miles a second. And I tried for quite a while to see if I could manage without it. And it really didn't work well for me. The third major class of medications that are used are atypical antipsychotic medications. So these are medications that, among other things, are reducing dopamine signaling. And they are more likely to reduce the manic side of the disorder. So they'll be used to reduce mania. And there's some medications that are used for long term. And there are some medications that are used if you notice that something is really not right. So I've become quite good at introspection and kind of looking at myself and going, am I moving into an elevated state, or am I becoming depressed, and taking action early on? So there are some medications, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but there's certain medications that are quite good for short-term use to kind of just get you back down. I found that if I start becoming manic, anything that will allow me to sleep is good. Because as soon as I start becoming manic, then I start staying up very late. I start, watching a lot of TV or listening to a lot of music or reading a lot or, watching YouTube or whatever it happens to be. But everything just seems exciting, and it's very hard for me to shut my brain off. And if you feed that animal, it just gets more and more aggressive, So you've really got to just realize, okay, hold on, this feels good. I need to take a step back. I need to sleep. What can I do to get to sleep? And a medication might be a way to do that. Another thing that I'll do is I'll just go for a walk. I'll get out into nature. I won't allow myself to follow that pleasure. I won't allow myself to keep listening to that song that sounds really good, or to keep writing that book that's really engaging me, or to do whatever it is that goal-directed behavior. So I'll deliberately have to pull myself out of it, but that's something that's hard to learn how to do. Okay, so those are the three major types of medications. In terms of other things that can be done, the form of therapy that's got the most research behind it, and therefore has got the most evidence for it in terms of helping with bipolar disorder, is CBT. And forms of CBT. So DBT is another form of cognitive type of therapy that can be used. There's often family-focused therapy. And maybe just going back, CBT can be very useful in terms of thinking clearly about things, as opposed to allowing your affective states to dominate, your emotions to dominate. Cognitive behavioral therapy can be useful in getting you to really think about things and process them and make rational decisions. Family-focused therapy is often used, and that's what my workshops in the past have focused on, is speaking to family members and friends and even colleagues of people with the diagnosis, so that they've got a better understanding of what it's about. One of the worst things about the diagnosis is the stigma around it and the misunderstanding around it. So if people around you understand a little bit more about it, it makes you feel safe. It makes you feel connected. But if you feel like you're dealing with it on your own, that can be very difficult. So family-focused therapy brings your support structure in and tries to make that support structure as strong as possible. Then there's something called social rhythms or interpersonal and social rhythms therapy, or something along those lines. I don't know what the name is exactly, but this is focusing on, for example, your relationships. So it's not just family and friends, but it's just generally how you interact with people. So it's really kind of focusing on that. It's focusing on your sleep. It's focusing on your exercise. It's focusing on your management of stress, which are all really important things. So for example, I will be in bed by 9:30 most nights. It's very rare that I stay up beyond 11 o'clock. That's not something that I do. And if I do, it will be one night. It certainly won't be 2 nights in a row. Managing alcohol and drug use is crucial. So a lot of people try to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. I, for a long period, just avoided it completely. I mean, when I say I might have,
half a sip
once in a while, I'm not exaggerating. I don't like the feeling of not being in control, because I know what it's like to really not be in control. So I like this sense of sanity and clarity, and I don't like that, and it certainly does help a lot. The other thing is exercise. So for anyone that's trying to manage any sort of mental health condition, if your body is in good shape, diet and exercise, that's going to affect how your brain works. And I've found that if I'm exercising regularly, if I'm eating well, everything feels good. I feel calm. I don't get overwhelmed easily. I don't get stressed out easily. And that's really important. 3 of the major triggers for mania are psychological stress, sleep disruption, and goal attainment, as we've discussed before. So managing stress in your life can be really important. So that's work stress, and CBT can help you to manage stress. And I mean, a simple example of CBT, and for those who don't know, that's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's about changing the way that you think about things to change the emotional impact of those things. In South Africa, we've got taxis that drive around. So there are these minibuses that are driven around, and they generally don't care about the rules of the road. So they'll stop anywhere, they'll pull in front of you. Often their lights are not working, and they're quite dangerous. So the response to a lot of people to these taxis is frustration. The CBT response would be, okay, what's the situation? You've got these taxis that are driving around, and they drive very dangerously. And whenever they pull out in front of you without indicating, you get frustrated. Is that doing you any good? Okay, no. Can you change this in any way? No. Okay, so can you think of anything useful that these taxis are doing? Yes, they are transporting people that don't have a lot of money from the worst conditions ever in townships to come and work in the areas that we are living. And so reframing that situation like that, now when you see a taxi, okay, it's not going to work every time, but you're more able to kind of say, okay, it's useless for me to get frustrated about this. If I notice a taxi, I'm like, okay, there's a pretty good chance that this person is going to pull out recklessly or stop in the middle, do a U-turn in the middle of an intersection or something. I know what my response to this is going to be. It's not going to be a surprise. I'm not going to respond in a frustrated way. So that's a very simple example of how CBT can lower the stress in your life. And it can be at work, it can be in relationships, but that's how therapy can be useful in minimizing one of the major triggers of further episodes. Yeah.
We also, within CBT, coming from Beck's original cognitive therapy, have this kind of self-observation of, what am I saying to myself? How am I interpreting the world?
Yeah.
So if you are, putting yourself down, and a tremendous amount of people have an internal voice. I don't.
Yeah.
I feel quite lucky about that. But some people soothe themselves and have an encouraging voice, and other people are forever criticizing themselves. So if they knock something over, there'll be an internal voice that's going, I'm always doing that. I'm so clumsy, that sort of thing. And being aware of your self-instruction, of what you're saying to yourself, and becoming dispassionate about that, kind of going, oh yeah, I do that. And, it's not good to be carrying that process on. My dad had a thing about the road that he said, just presume that all other drivers are insane.
Yeah.
And, he didn't have any road accidents, so it helped in some way. And so often we do wind ourselves up. We do get ourselves into a state trying to exert control from our minds in some way onto the world around. And why aren't people being rational? Why isn't the world fair? Well, people aren't generally rational, and the world isn't fair. And we need to relax a bit more about that. And obviously, if this is potentially going to trigger a state within you, you need to be even more careful about it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that those would be the things: medication, therapy, if you can afford it. Otherwise, there are ways that you can teach yourself some of those skills just by going onto YouTube and that sort of thing. Trying to educate people around you, and that's kind of like building a little bit of a bubble around you, because the public is going to be poorly informed about these sorts of things. I know in the UK, they've actually been very good about mental health awareness. Australia and the UK, it seems like they've had quite a lot of campaigns to try and raise awareness of mental health. In the US, it's more difficult because the states, it's so big, and to kind of get a national campaign going is quite difficult. So some states are different to others. In South Africa, it's not a major area of focus. You have your mental health days, but the people's understanding of it is not great. I think other things that I found useful in terms of managing it were to try to focus on some of the positives. So recognize that there are negatives, but focus on the positives. To be more forgiving of people that have got misconceptions about it. I mean, even after, completing my master's, so before doing my PhD, I was put in touch with somebody who had schizophrenia, and she was an advocate for addressing stigma for schizophrenia. And even though I knew how completely wrong the perception of bipolar disorder was, I didn't think to myself, maybe my understanding of schizophrenia is distorted. And when I met her, I was like, oh, this person's so much more normal than I expected them to be. And it was such a reality check to me that, like, oh, even though I've got this insight into stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination and complete misconceptions, I still have these perceptions in other areas. I mean, other things that I found quite useful, and that sort of insight. So coming from South Africa, and as a white person in South Africa, obviously we've got this real history of racial divide and racism and prejudice and that sort of thing. And it really gave me a lot of insight in terms of, oh, like now I kind of get it, that people might have a completely incorrect understanding of a group of people based on just like really poor information. So that was useful for me to kind of be able to look and go, okay, now I understand that people have got this understanding of bipolar disorder that is really distorted, and it's quite fixed, and it's quite difficult to change. And all the information that you provide people doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to change their perspectives. So that was quite a useful thing for me. I mean, in terms of the the stigma. As I said, depression, people often look at it like, come on, sort yourself out. There are other disorders that have got different things associated with them. So schizophrenia has got quite a negative stigma. Bipolar disorder, when I was diagnosed, nobody knew anything about it. I'd never heard the term at the time of my diagnosis. Now it's far more common. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So people hear about it, but when you see these memes going around on Instagram and on Facebook and whatever, it reveals quite a severe misunderstanding of what the disorder is actually like. You know, I think what people also don't realize is that in movies and television, there's a strong incentive to not only exaggerate the symptoms, but only show the characters that have these disorders when they are displaying symptoms.
Yeah.
So it's not like somebody's going to write a series and be like, okay, this person's got bipolar disorder, but they're in a euthymic period. Everything's fine. They're taking their medication. They're sleeping well. They're going to work.
Doesn't make for great TV, does it?
It's like,
really?
well, what's the point of the person having the disorder if they're not doing all the cool, crazy stuff that, you know, makes it interesting? So you get this bias in terms of you get a sampling bias when you see the disorder. You see it when it's problematic, and that's true in real life as well. So there's so many people that are taking their medications, going to work, you know, great husbands, wives, parents, employees, bosses, all that sort of thing. The only time you're going to know that they have bipolar disorder is when something goes wrong. Then you're going to go, oh, that's what it is. You're not going to notice when everything's fine. So that's problematic. Two series that have shown bipolar disorder recently, and both of them were actually wonderful depictions of bipolar disorder. So the one is Homeland, where Claire Danes was playing that agent.
Yeah,
and
brilliant. Yeah,
I think that she's an amazing actor, and the portrayal was really wonderful in most parts. The thing that people have to remember is that that's a person with bipolar disorder who's a CIA agent doing the most stressful job ever. So yes, that is accurate for what happens to a person with bipolar disorder if they are under threat of death and whatever else for long periods of time. So yeah, it's accurate, but it's kind of unfair to say that that's an accurate depiction of bipolar disorder for somebody like me who has decided to go into academia. Generally, it's less stressful than being an undercover CIA operative.
Generally.
I imagine, yeah. And then there was a great depiction. I don't know what the actor's name is. There was a series, Ozark, Jason Bateman, and Laura Linney. And Laura Linney's younger brother is bipolar, and it's an incredible performance. It's I mean, I just felt that's what it feels like to be manic and frightened, and also quite I'm trying to think of the word now, quite idealistic, like wanting to do the right thing and just not caring about the consequences. It's like, this is what has to be done. And he was brilliant. But again, showing this person who wasn't taking their medication and was put in an incredibly difficult, stressful situation. And this is how he responded. It would be nice if they showed the 10 years of life, you know, beforehand, if he had been taking his meds and how he would have behaved then. So I think those are some of the things that are frustrating, because as we spoke about in the last episode, the elaboration likelihood model, if a person's motivation and ability to think about a topic is low, then they're going to rely on heuristics. And not many people are motivated to go and read Kay Jamison's books or to read other things on bipolar disorder to really understand what it's about. So their motivation is not going to be high, so they're going to rely on heuristics. What are they going to rely on? They're going to rely on what they've seen on TV. They're going to rely
popular
on what
culture.
they've seen in a movie, and that is going to feed into what their understanding is of the disorder. And I would say that this is actually true to an extent of clinicians as well. So if you think about psychiatrists and psychologists, I know the UK is, you know, going to see a psychologist or psychiatrist, I don't know what it costs over there. Here it is incredibly expensive.
We have a National Health Service where you will have to wait for a long time, but it won't cost you anything.
Okay, so I would say in South Africa, you will go and see a psychologist when things are really bad. You won't go just weekly, unless you're a very wealthy person. You will go when things are really bad. Same with the psychiatrist. You probably will go when things are not great. So they are, again, seeing a distorted sample of people with all of the disorders. They're seeing them at their worst. And unless they have the system 2 engagement to kind of go, hold on a second, I must recognize that I'm not seeing a representative sample of people with these disorders, their understanding of those disorders is going to be distorted as well. And so it's quite hard to have a fair and rational and accurate understanding of bipolar disorder or any of the disorders. And as I've said, my understanding of schizophrenia, even though I've studied the symptoms, I've read books on it, I still had this idea in my head of what it was like, and was quite surprised when I engaged with this person who had the disorder.
And we have the misperception in popular culture that schizophrenia is multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, as it's now called, which it is not, never has been. I've had the fortune to know several schizophrenics over the years, and one of the things that was, I had a next door neighbor, and he was highly rational, highly articulate. He was very keen on the philosophy of Kierkegaard, I remember, which was beyond me, and he'd be absolutely fine. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, this behavior would come along. And that's been my experience, that generally people, schizophrenia is a bit of a vague label, I think, still. But people who are diagnosed, it doesn't mean that they're bonkers, they're crazy, they're out of it. It means that there are times when it's too much. There are times when their behavior is difficult, and you have to be considerate of that. I think also what you say, that the reason that awareness in the UK has increased is probably due to the exposure of celebrities who suffer from the condition. So Stephen Fry is the most significant among them.
And he's a wonderful example, because he is so articulate and so considered in his thoughts. I think some of the celebrities who claim it's, I kind of feel like, oh, I wish it wasn't you. And I think that sometimes, and I'm not sure about this, but it seems like occasionally it can be used as an excuse for terrible behavior, when they come out and they go, actually, I was bipolar and that's why I did X, Y, and Z. So
well, I mean, the other example here is Alistair Campbell, who was an advisor to Tony Blair.
Yes.
And I have a contempt for spin doctors, so I don't think he's a good example. And you're going, so let's see, you were advising the head of government, and sometimes if you got it wrong, you say, well, I was feeling a bit depressed that day, what have you. Whereas with Stephen Fry, there is something about him that has made him represent what is best about being English for some reason. Then you look into his history and you find out that he was convicted of check fraud and sent to prison when he was about 19. And had it not been for Hugh Laurie and his partnership with him, he might never have had a career. But if you look back at that, the energized aspect of the condition, the amount of work this man has done, the amount of books he's written, and if you buy something on Audible, then there's a very high chance that he's the guy that read it out. It drives him. But also, of course, there was a point where he was appearing in a play on the West End in London, and he just didn't show up. And they found out that he'd gone to France instead. So he was having a manic episode. And because he is so personable, so likable, and evidently so incredibly intelligent. This is a man who reads 2 books a day. It takes me 2 weeks to read a book. And he can remember what he's seen, and it shows that you can have a high intelligence living alongside this condition. And also he's a man who's done a great deal for gay rights. Has traveled the world and talked with very peculiar people who basically want to kill anybody who's homosexual, and started to change attitudes about that. So I think that's very important. I have one last question, and
I have one last comment as
Oh,
well.
you make your
So,
one last
yeah.
comment, and I'll ask you my one last question.
So just in light of what you've just said about Stephen Fry, I mean, I think that, and again, this is something that I say, I had a woman at one of my workshops say to me, she said, my ex-husband was bipolar and he behaved so terribly and whatever. How do I forgive him? How do I kind of accept X, Y, and Z? And my response to that is, it needs to be earned. So you're not manic the whole time. You're not depressed the whole time. There are times when you're okay. When you're okay, you need to demonstrate that you are trying to manage the disorder well. That means if you've got substance abuse issues, you need to try to deal with them. You need to manage your sleep. You need to try and exercise. You need to get your diet right. You need to get things in place and demonstrate to the people around you that you are trying to manage this thing well. Things will go wrong, but you're going to have a lot more support and a lot more empathy from people around you if you've demonstrated that you are actually trying to get this thing right. So if you're not taking your meds, if you're just, saying, well, I'm bipolar, so I've got an excuse to do whatever I like, then I don't think that somebody should be supporting you. You need to demonstrate that you are doing what you can to manage it. And obviously, Stephen Fry is an extreme example of somebody really showing that their heart is in the right place, that they're doing incredible things. But if something does go wrong, you've at least got all of this evidence to look at about what this person is like to weigh up against this thing that they may have done wrong. And that makes a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've before recommended Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep, which is, he's a professor at Berkeley, who actually did his internship here in Nottingham, and brings together sleep science. I must say I'm not keen on the way he writes, that he's a little bit purple for me. But putting that aside, he is readable, and he's saying, look, here are common assumptions, but this is what the science says about sleep. Sleep is incredibly important. You can't go without it. It's how the brain does housekeeping. It's how the brain gets rid of the mess. And I tend to agree with his point of view that for the most part, dreams are utterly irrelevant and have nothing to do with a therapeutic insight. Indeed, when we're in REM sleep, we're dreaming somewhere over 90% of the time. When we're in non-REM, the other three types of sleep, we're dreaming about 70% of the time. So we're only aware of just tiny fragments when we, are waking. And the idea that whole systems like psychoanalysis have been based on the interpretation of dreams is just ridiculous to me. But that's just me being insulting to Freud again. I think that I had an interesting experience with a friend who is bipolar some years ago. She said to me that she wished she could get high on cannabis. And I went away and thought about that. And I went, could it be that some people who have bipolar, because we now know that there are at least 2 endocannabinoid systems in the human body, and they have more regulatory function, so I have read, than any other systems in the body. And yet they are massively under-researched because they're connected to a substance that has been given a very bad reputation in the last century, largely based upon rumor. In South Africa, I think medicinal cannabis is now legal, I believe.
Yeah, people can use it in their homes. I think,
and recreationally, it can be used at home. You can, what have you. So the stigma is gone. I live in a country where it's not. We have draconian rules. You can still, for a first offence, go to prison for 14 years if a court believes that you've sought to supply cannabis.
Well, I saw an interesting debate or conversation with Alex O'Connor and Peter Hitchens on the topic very recently, where Peter Hitchens walked out of the conversation very, very angrily.
How unusual for Peter Hitchens.
Yeah, I mean,
not really.
I mean, I think it's useful to look at what he had to say, but he doesn't do himself any favors by just presenting his case in that way. And Alex O'Connor, I like the way he engages. He's very sort of open. He thinks about things a lot, and I think he was being quite polite. And anyway, but yeah, that topic, I was aware that in the UK there are these rules, but my understanding is that they're not enforced.
Well, they're enforced to a different degree, but of course it's always rather awful if you're being told this could happen to you if we don't like you. And when you have a rule that, you know, but without getting into the whole debate about, you know, legality, I think the Canadians took the right approach. But one should say that Canada was one of the first, if not the first, Western country to ban cannabis in 1924, based upon a novel called The Black Candle, published under the pseudonym Janie Cannock, who was a juvenile magistrate. And what she said was that the flower of white womanhood would be destroyed because if white women smoke cannabis, they will have sex with black men and there will be miscegenation and the white race will be polluted. And that was enough to persuade the Canadian Parliament to make the drug illegal. The British Parliament followed 4 years later with no more research than that, which...
That sounds like a Manson type of theory, something that he would latch onto.
Yeah, it's not tremendously clever. But when my friend said this thing about cannabis, you know, the endocannabinoid systems in the body, CB1 and CB2, and there may be a CB3 that's being put forward, I kind of went, well, we've had this problem with high-strength cannabis, that as it's been hybridized, the delta-9 THC, the active, or one of the psychoactive ingredients, I think they may have presumed a bit too much about that, but certainly the main ingredient, psychoactive, has been bred to be higher and higher in, you know, White Widow and all of these kind of strains. And at the same time, cannabidiol has gone down as you bred, and we start seeing these short-term cannabis psychosis episodes, people who've taken huge amounts of the stuff. And the thought is that by raising the cannabidiol level, you are less likely to have that. Now, you mentioned anti-epileptic drugs. Of course, cannabis is an effective anti-epileptic for certain types of epilepsy. That's actually caused the British government to change the law in 2018 and say, all right, cannabis can be used, it can be used as medicine, because it was a legal matter. You couldn't go to the court and say, I was using it because I have Parkinson's disease or cancer or any of the many things to which there is some real world evidence. And my thought was, well, it could be for some people who are experiencing bipolar, they're overproducing the chemical anandamide, which is the human analog of the delta-9 THC. And therefore, my friend would not, you know, if as she was in a hypomanic state, it would have no effect putting more of this chemical into her system. But what might have an effect for her is to use cannabidiol. Now, cannabidiol is perfectly legal in this country. Strangely enough, it's not psychoactive at all. And it doesn't appear to have much in the way of side effects. I wonder if you're aware of any, because I then went online and found people with bipolar.
I must say, I haven't done a lot of research into cannabis and its relationship with bipolar disorder. All that I know about it is that there is a subset of people that experience psychosis from taking even small quantities of it, and it can really wreck their lives. And I think that screening those people out is obviously quite important, and more research is necessary on it. And I know that in terms of treating bipolar symptoms, the only thing that it seems to be good for, based on the current research, is, you know, helping people to sleep. And as we've mentioned, you know, I have stages where I need to sleep because I feel like my mind's working too quickly. I don't use marijuana. I will use something else. Even just withdrawing and, you know, using sleep hygiene to make sure that I go to sleep. So that's the limit of my knowledge of.
I mean, I'd sternly question the idea that small amounts of cannabis can lead to psychosis. Looking at David Nutt's work, which has been very deep, he was the head of our government's advisory committee on the misuse of drugs. Okay. He stands against that idea. Cannabis psychosis comes about by using too much cannabis. So somebody having a hit on a spliff is not going to become psychotic.
Well, it seems like
the literature
it
which
also
I have
seems like
studied
if
in
it's
some depth,
yeah, it seems like if it's people that start using it at a very young age, so maybe it's not not a
Yeah,
single
this is a
puff,
long
but
another discussion.
yeah,
That's the New
yeah,
Zealand study, and
yeah,
it's people. That's not people using small amounts of cannabis. That was adolescents who were daily smoking large amounts of cannabis, and it didn't lead to psychosis. It led to underperformance or demotivation, which is not really surprising. If you sit around using a drug all day, you probably don't do your
yeah,
schoolwork. But yeah, I sorry, I wanted to put that in there to see if you thought about it, and it's because you mentioned the use of anti-epileptics, and we do know that there are, as you're saying, signals cross too fast over the corpus
yeah,
callosum in epilepsy, and that it certainly seems to be, that cannabis should be researched in this context, that it
yeah.
hasn't been, it is interesting. So I'm absolutely not recommending the use of it. I was just curious to see if you'd heard anything about it.
Well, I mean, again, for example, like psilocybin, ketamine, electroconvulsive therapy, there are some treatments for bipolar disorder and depression that are emerging now, becoming more popular now, becoming more accepted. Some of them are kind of like last line treatments. So ECT, for example, if you're experiencing
chronic depression
that's just not responding to anything else, then it seems like it does work quite well, although there are some side effects to it.
Like loss of memory.
Yeah, I mean, so for exactly. So I'm certainly open to anything that might prove useful, but the process, as with everything, is always going to be do the science, do the research, demonstrate the effectiveness, make sure that we understand the risks, and then great, bring in something new.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty has been that licenses have not been granted for research, except in Canada, of course, and in Israel, where there has been, I mean, there was a gold standard study in Canada a few years ago, which demonstrated that cannabis is effective for pain in as many cases as morphine is effective, and of course doesn't cause spasticity of the gut, cessation of peristaltic motion as all of the opioids will, and doesn't have the same dependency problems. It's not, you don't have huge withdrawal symptoms, but absolutely we have this problem. And I came up through an idea of science that talks about anecdotal evidence, and you just dismiss anything that people say. We're now hearing this expression, real world evidence, where if thousands of people report something, then we should be pushing for research. And because the endocannabinoid system is inevitably involved in epilepsy and in bipolar, because it's involved in just about everything, this is a place where I think there should be research. My curiosity was just to see if you knew of any such research.
Not yet, but now I feel like I need to go and do a little bit of
reading.
You
do quickly, don't sleep, go and do it. Yeah. And putting all of that aside, and we might actually cut that last bit out, this has been fantastic. This has been really wonderful, John. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. Yeah, it's great to chat about this. And as I say again, just having an opportunity to share some information on this disorder, which I think is often very badly understood or very poorly understood, is great. So thanks.
Great. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.